Hey there. Let's talk about the Devonian. So continuing on in the Paleozoic era, let's talk about the Devonian period. So the Devonian, kind of in the early parts of it, was looking somewhat like this on Earth. We get these two kind of mega supercontinents coming together that would eventually form an even bigger supercontinent, Pangea. So you see that occurring. This little orangish line with the triangles is indicating a convergent boundary with subduction going on, with the triangles point in the direction of the subduction. So Gondwana is starting to subduct underneath this Euramerica continent, supercontinent. So the North America itself kind of looked like this. Here's Arizona. Yet another time we've been underwater. Remember, what is now Arizona? Sometimes it's above water, sometimes it's below water. We get sediment deposited. We talked about this kind of stuff, transgressions, regressions, sediment deposition, layers of the Grand Canyon, all that kind of stuff. But here's a good example of where almost all of Arizona, well, what would eventually become Arizona, was under the oceans. The equator is here, so we're still south of the equator, and we're continuing to kind of turn this way, but we are kind of moving up. Ugh. So here in the Devonian, we get a big drop in carbon dioxide. And that large part of that is due to plants. Plants for photosynthesis take in carbon dioxide. So that was occurring. You would think that oxygen then would go up, but it started to go down, and that both of these kind of lead to an interesting thing that happened at the end of the Devonian, and we'll talk about that. So the Devonian was about 419.2 to 358.9 million years ago. Along with the Silurian, but more so in the Devonian, this is known as the Age of Fishes. Fishes really began to become prominent and diversified. Early tetrapod, these are fishes with little kind of like lobed legs, which were the ancestors of land-dwelling vertebrates, things with backbones, first appeared during the Devonian. Remember, life began in the ocean and had to make its way onto land. So we needed some sort of organism from the water to make its way onto the land. So interesting fish type was one of those early ancestors, believe it or not. Remember, we started to get land plants in the last period, so those started to diversify a little bit. The first forests finally appear, and the first plants that had seeds. Soil began to develop. Soil is, we talked about this in a previous lecture. Remember, soil is dirt and organic matter mixed together. If there was nothing living on land, then there was no soil. It was just dirt. But as the Paleozoic progressed and plants started to move onto land, leaves and sticks and dead plants, as they kind of fall to the ground and get mixed in with the dirt, create soil. And this is allowing more plants then to reproduce on land. So it's helping to get even more plants. During the Devonian, we get the oldest fossils of insects and spiders. And so, yeah, that's always fun. And then we had a mass extinction, and super interesting mass extinction. So, what did it look like? Probably something like this. All right, got diversification of some new weird fishes. Again, ones that kind of have somewhat little leg. Tetrapod, tetra means four, so like maybe four little legs, things that can kind of make their way up. Again, diversification of plants. Yeah, all kinds of fun stuff. So again, this is the Age of Fishes. The most diversified animal group was the fishes during the Devonian. There's two prominent groups: the agnathans, which were the jawless fish, so fish with no jaws, just mouth holes, and the placoderms, which were the first jawed fish, and very strong jaws as well. Some of the placoderms reached really, really big size. In the background here, we'll look more on this. This is a placoderm back here, thing with the jaw. Dunkleosteus, or terror fish, reached up to, at least the biggest fossil we have, about 26 feet, 8 meters in length, with a skull that was 4 feet across. It's like that big. That's a big skull. Some other groups of fish that began to pop up. Again, things were diversifying. You get sharks. You get lobed fin fish. That's kind of these rounded finned fish that kind of, again, lead to these tetrapods. Examples of those include coelacanths, I know that's how it's pronounced, coelacanths, and lungfish, and ancestors of some of the ray-finned fish, things like nowadays trout, salmon, tuna, those sorts of things. So a lot of diversification in fish. What's interesting about these lobed fin fish is that they breathe air when they raise their head above water. All right, so they actually come up and breathe the air. So, by the way, all fish breathe water. When the fish that kind of live in the water with gills, when they take in the water, and what they're doing is they're taking out the oxygen that's dissolved in the water. There's microscopic oxygen within the water, and they're kind of taking that out with their gills. That's what they do. They breathe oxygen. All fish breathe oxygen. But some of the lobed fin fish actually come out of the water and kind of just breathe a little bit. And again, this is a very necessary adaptation for animals to eventually make their way onto land. So this is an example of a jawless fish coming back, the agnathans. It's got a mouthful and some teeth. It's kind of terrifying to look at, but it doesn't have a jaw. I know, kind of weird. And then this is an example of the jawed fish. This is a coelacanth. This is that thing that had the biggest fossil was 26 feet long and the head about 4 feet wide. On average, though, they're kind of really on par nowadays with a great white shark. Here's a fossil skull of a Dunkleosteus, and then a human for reference. And you can see those teeth are actually part of the jaw, so just, man, that'd bite through anything. Some interesting shark species kind of first evolved. A little flat top and the sawtooth. I question this one. I think the fossil that they found of this, that just looks so inefficient. I could be wrong. But the fossil that they found of this, I think it was just squished. That's a guess. I don't know. I wasn't there. The jaw was squished, so it looked like it's a saw blade, but I don't know. That just doesn't look efficient. Could be wrong. And here are some of those kind of lobed fin lungfish. You can see that we still have some today that actually come up to breathe the oxygen or breathe the air, and they take out the oxygen that way. So anyway, very diversification of fish. We also have some great plant diversification, and this is actually what's going to lead to the extinction event at the end of this period. So as plants kind of moved out onto land, they needed stronger structures. In water, plants can be kind of soft and float. They don't need structure. Like we have our bones for structure, but plants, they just didn't have a solid structure. They were already in water. They were fine. But when they made their way to land, they needed some sort of structure to support their weight now that they're in air. And so they also needed a way to conserve water because now they're on land. They're not in water. They don't just get to have water. They have to save and conserve it. So this really started to favor plant species with kind of thicker stems and eventually wood, things that could provide structure and kind of hold water, essentially. And we talked about this. That's the vascular system we kind of talked about previously. So that kind of favored what was going on. Again, it wasn't much going on Earth, at least initially in this period. But this is kind of how it possibly started off. And then there was the 4 adaptations that really helped to diversify the plant species to eventually grow into large trees. And finally, the development of the forest, which happened during this period. You know what? Before I continue, let me give you the next part of the super secret code. It is the number 7. The number 7. You got me? The number 7. So anyway, 4 adaptations. 1, that helped plants diversify. 1, roots. So plants started to get roots. Roots improved water and nutrient absorption from the now created soil and gave them an anchor, which helped them to be more stable. So that kind of first appeared during this Devonian period. So they got roots. Soil began to develop as a byproduct of all of this. Again, dirt, organic material mixed together is soil. So maybe plants started to diversify and started to look like this. We started to get trees. We started to get forests. You can see these roots kind of digging down into the earth. Plants started to, so that was 1, roots. 2, seeds. So seeds allowed plants to disseminate over long distances, whether by wind kind of blowing seeds or by organisms eventually eating the plant material and pooping out the seeds. So the seeds allowed plants to kind of move around and move further. Leaves. Instead of just like stems and stuff, leaves provide more surface area for photosynthesis. So roots, seeds, leaves, and then that woody tissue to help stabilize the plants, as well as provide some sort of structure and way to conserve water. Those four things are what really helped plants diversify. And so again, maybe as we're getting through into the end of the Devonian, we start seeing things kind of like this. Again, we also have the first insects, and that happened not too long after the first land plants developed. Go figure, first plants and then insects. Not all insects. I'll get to that maybe in a bit. But also with insects on land, this might have been why some amphibians began to populate the continents in the next period, the Mississippian, because amphibians, you think like frogs and stuff, with their tongue, they eat bugs. Well, now there's this food source on land, and now these organisms that are evolving to be amphibians were like, wow, we can go on land because there's a lot of food there. So you can see how one step leads to the next step, leads to the next step. Early insects were initially wingless. Collembolans, or springtails, appear to be the oldest known insects. Today, the insects are the most numerous terrestrial animals on Earth, the most diversified, most numerous now, both in number of species and individuals. And yes, insects are in the animal kingdom, believe it or not. So here is kind of some fossils of maybe some early organisms, springtails, and kind of how their modern ancestors look today. That actually one's pretty cute. But as mentioned, as we get to the end of the Devonian, we get an extinction that occurs. And about 75% of all life died during this period. And here's the thing. One hypothesis, remember theory is a big word. One hypothesis suggests that plants and their roots were the cause of this extinction. Stick with me now. As the roots dig into the ground, it allows the ground to kind of break up and some nutrients to be released. Those nutrients, as soil is being created and broken up, those nutrients, as they get into the river systems and then flow into the ocean, contain a lot of organic nutrients, things that plants love. Well, in the ocean, you get microscopic plants, algae, the green stuff, the green scum that forms on the top of like ponds and stuff. So you get all this nutrients, a food source, nitrogen and other things, flowing into the ocean. Now all of a sudden algae have like this mega food source, so algae bloom goes crazy. There's a bunch of algae now in the ocean. Well, when algae dies, it has a very short life and decays. That decaying process requires oxygen. Oxygen helps the material, the algae, to decay. So, but that takes the oxygen out of the water. So by taking oxygen out of the water, and remember, fish breathe oxygen, there was very little or less oxygen in the ocean water, so all these fish started dying because they couldn't breathe. At least the ones that, have gills and require them to stay underwater. Some of the ones that kind of popped up and only require low amounts of oxygen were fine. But it's funny, so the plants with the roots eventually hypothesized caused a mass extinction in the ocean. Quite interesting. The sponges, corals, the brachiopods, the two-shelled thing, trilobites, ammonites, those were kind of decimated. Some of the vertebrates weren't not strongly affected, but they did have some diversity loss, like fishes. That it wasn't wiped out, but there was some. Little known on land about what went extinct. Not a lot of fossil records, but again, it's that development of forests that triggered the whole thing. Interesting, huh? So again, yeah, this is a lot of these are kind of what went out as we're getting into the Mississippian and Pennsylvanian. So here we are getting into, again, the Carboniferous here in the U.S. is split into two different periods, but we're getting into the place where we have the first reptiles, and then we're getting eventually into mammals and so on and so forth. All right, so let's go ahead and pause there. When we come back, we'll talk about the first half of the Carboniferous, the Mississippian. See you in a second.